Early on the overcast afternoon of June 2, 1944, three white-starred Boeing B-17 flying fortresses in V formation roared over the Soviet airbase at Poltava. Within moments, the entire countryside reverberated from 256 powerful Pratt and Whitney engines as flight after flight of the heavy bombers roared overhead. American ground crewmen standing in the light rain watched with open pride as the first silvery plane touched down on the steel mat runway. The name Yankee Doodle 2nd was boldly painted on the fuselage just behind the plexiglass nose. East meets West. In one triumphant moment, Lieutenant General Ira C. Eaker, head of the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces, climbed down from the four-engined bomber. The rugged 50-year-old Texan, a pioneer of post-World War I military aviation, had led the first U.S. heavy bomber raid on Nazi-held Western Europe 2 years earlier. Accepting a bouquet of flowers from a buxom, smiling Russian female soldier, he passed around a handful of cigars before taking the welcoming hand of Soviet Major General Alexei R. Permanov. Eaker also plucked a Legion of Merit medal from his pocket and pinned it on Permanov's tunic. Greetings were exchanged with American Ambassador W. Averill Harriman and U.S. Military Mission Chief Major General John R. Dean, as well as with other Russian officers on hand for the occasion. Harriman's daughter, Kathy, stood by holding a bouquet of roses. The 64 B-17S at Poltava and 65 other bombers and 64 fighters of the U.S. 15th Air Force that landed at two neighboring bases were the spearhead of Operation Frantic, America's World War II effort to strike at enemy targets in Eastern Europe from England and Italy, using bases in the Soviet Union to refuel and rearm. The concept of taking off from one airfield and landing at a second on the other side of otherwise unreachable targets was raised by U.S. planners early in the war. Since Hitler controlled most of continental Europe, air bases would have to be in the British Isles, the Mediterranean area, and the Soviet Union to make shuttle bombing fully effective. The first shuttle bombing mission was between Great Britain and Italy in 1943. Adding Russia was hoped to greatly enhance the concept. Shuttle bombing. Both strategic and diplomatic American leaders proposed the use of Russian bases with a number of general goals in mind: strategic and tactical bombing in distant Eastern Europe, stretching Nazi air defense forces, especially prior to the Allied invasion of France, and demonstrating to the Soviets, who had no long-range bombing force, the sincerity and effectiveness of the U.S. war effort, thereby improving Soviet-American relations and the exchange of information. It was also hoped that shuttle bombing in the European theater would lead to the use of bases in Siberia to strike Japan. What would become Operation Frantic was proposed in mid-1942 to the Soviets, who received the idea coolly. Aptly named, the operation was destined to be a short-lived child of a questionable marriage. The subject of shuttle bombing was again broached at the Moscow Conference in October 1943, when the newly arrived chief of the U.S. military mission to Russia, General Dean, discussed it with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. Once more, the response was inconclusive. It took President Franklin D. Roosevelt to break the logjam by talking to Russia's paranoid dictator, Joseph Stalin, at the November 1943 Tehran Conference. But even then, it was not until February 2, 1944, that Stalin told Ambassador Harriman, "We favor it," at a Kremlin meeting. The operation, initially named Baseball, possibly an expectation of the team playing it would foster, was renamed Frantic in March 1944. Realty falls short of initial hopes. The reality, however, immediately fell short of the American hope for 6 airfields manned by more than 2,000 men. There would be only 3 bases: Poltava, Mirgorod, 50 miles to the west, and Pyryatyn, another 50 miles west, situated on the flat farmland of the east-central Ukraine in a southeast to northwest line about 450 miles southwest of Moscow, and about half as many ground crewmen as proposed. The bases were much farther east than desired and in almost unusable shape, but it was a question of take it or leave it. Dean was to have administrative control of the operation, while Lieutenant General Carl A. Spaatz, commander of U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe, would be in charge of operations. On-site supervision of the freshly created Eastern Command fell to Major General Robert L. Walsh when it became fully operational on June 1, 1944. Poltava was selected as U.S. Soviet headquarters for the eastern terminus of the shuttle bombing program. It was at Poltava that the overconfident Swedes under Charles XII were bloodied 235 years earlier by the Russian forces of Peter the Great, thereby establishing Russia as a world power. In 1941, the area was occupied by Hitler's Wehrmacht, which found itself welcomed by a significant part of the populace. When the Nazis retreated, they leveled virtually every building except for private dwellings. The post-occupation attitude of the Poltavans, however, was illustrated by a photograph they eagerly showed the Americans. It depicted the mayor who had ruled during the German occupation with an alpenstock smashed into his skull. Runway highlight of makeshift Russian airfield engineers from the United States, working with mostly Russian labor and virtually all American material and supplies, lengthened the Poltava runway assigned to them to over a mile and covered it with pierced steel matting. Taxi strips, hard stands, and storage areas were set up. The Russian flight line at the end of a 500-foot-long concrete runway was situated on the other side of several damaged buildings from the American one. Among the red-starred aircraft parked there were American-built Douglas C-47 transports and Russian-made single-engine Yakovlev Yak-9S of the 210th Fighter Interceptor Division. Across a road from their flight line, the Americans oversaw the erection of some 150 pyramidal tents for the ground and bomber crews. The mess hall and hospital tents were sandwiched into this section, whose extremity was marked by a series of twisting trenches for use as air raid shelters. The U.S. command staff and its Russian counterpart were quartered across the road from the Russian flight line in a damaged, multi-storied, U-shaped building that also served as base headquarters. A wider road winding between the building and the American tents ran southward roughly 2 miles to the town of Poltava. Modifications were also made to the 2 other bases. Allied command relents to Russian objectives. By mid-1944, Frantic was ready to go. A U.S. communications center overseen by the Soviets was functioning. The ground support personnel, their entry into the Soviet Union closely controlled by Moscow, were in place. Even the initial targets, aircraft factories at Riga in Latvia or at Mielec, Poland, had been chosen. Since the 8th Air Force, based in England, was already deeply involved in the bombing of Germany and preparations for the imminent invasion of Normandy, the honor of inaugurating Operation Frantic went to the Italy-based 15th Air Force. The Soviets dismayed the Americans by vetoing the target selection. Bomb Romania or Hungary instead, they countered. It was pointed out that those countries were within range of bases in Italy. The Russians, more interested in tactical objectives to support their advance than in strategic matters, were adamant. Dean and Spatz decided in the Soviets' favor because, in the reluctant Eaker's words, "It is imperative that we gain the full confidence and respect of the Russians by starting our collaboration with an operation of immediate significance to them." At 6:55 a.m. on June 2, 1944, Frantic Joe, the first combat mission of the new shuttle program, took to the air from airfields in Italy. 4 groups of B-17 bombers and 1 group of the checker-tailed North American P-51 Mustang fighters from the 5th Combat Wing droned northeastward in clear weather, their aiming point the rail hub of Debrecen, Hungary. 3 hours later, bomb bay doors yawned wide to disgorge over 1,500 pounders on the enemy railroad yards. The escorting P-51 pilots scanned the cumulus speckled sky in vain for intercepting fighters. Impressed Russians consent to factory targets. The only loss was a flying fortress that exploded in midair. While General Eaker and his airmen were being welcomed with flowers at Poltava, the other bombers landed at Mirgorod. The fighters, after initial trouble finding the base, landed at Pyriatin. Following the airfield ceremonies and a short meeting at the Poltava headquarters, Eaker, the Harrimans, and Dean went on to Moscow in a Russian C-47. There, the Americans again raised the question of aircraft plant targeting. Surprisingly, this time the Soviets consented. Eaker was elated until he talked to his meteorologists. Bad weather over the targets, they reported. The big bombers, ready and loaded, sat waiting at the Russian bases. When the weather over East-Central Europe failed to clear by June 6th, the day Allied armies were storming ashore in France, Eaker sent most of his planes on a side mission against the Galati airfield in Romania. 2 P-51s went down during the mission. The Germans lost, in addition to aircraft destroyed on the ground, a possible 8 fighters, the first U.S. air victories on the Eastern Front. Initial success bodes well for future American-Soviet operations. 5 days later, still foiled by bad weather from hitting the originally targeted Heinkel plant in Poland, Eaker led his groups back to Italy. They bombed the Foxani airbase in eastern Romania on the way. The initial Frantic mission was completed. The ground crews at the 3 Russian bases were commended for their contribution. The first American task force ever to operate from Russian soil has returned to its bases. The commendation read in part, "The cooperation and understanding displayed in working with our Russian allies set an example for future American-Soviet operations." Wednesday, June 21, 1944, was a special day for the Americans stationed at the Soviet installations. A lot of old friends were in the 8th Air Force air crews making the first England to Russia shuttle raid. 20 bomb groups of heavy bombers and 23 fighter groups, almost 2,500 aircraft in the war's largest attack on the Berlin area, dropped over 2,000 tons of bombs on factories, railroad yards, and a synthetic oil plant. As the massive aerial armada swung back toward Great Britain, more than 140 Fortresses and 65 Mustangs, comprising Frantic 2, continued eastward. Touching down at Poltava after an 11-hour flight, 70 B-17Es of the 45th Bomb Wing were directed to disperse as best they could on the cramped eastern end of the field. Ground crewmen exuberantly greeted the newcomers, who were checked by Russian border guards before being shown to a tent for debriefing by intelligence officers and for the customary double hooker of scotch. The exhausted airmen were then fed and assigned temporary quarters. The accompanying 13th Bomb Wing elite at Mirgorod. 5 bombers running out of fuel had landed near Kiev, about 140 miles northwest of Poltava. The P-51s, except for 2 lost, came to ground at Pyryatyn, sniffing out the Soviet-American airfield. The Americans at Poltava would have been less jubilant had they known that they had been followed by a Heinkel He-177 piloted by Sergeant Hans Muller. The multi-engined reconnaissance bomber circled high above the base, taking pictures before turning back toward its base. As the German plane overflew Mirgorod, an American officer who spotted it wanted to radio Pyryatyn to send up Mustangs to shoot it down. The Soviets, making no effort to intercept the intruder themselves, denied permission. It was also later reported that the enemy had recovered maps and photographs of the Poltava base from a shuttle bomber that crashed during the June 11th raid on Foxani. American complacency made the situation even riper for disaster. The newly arrived bombers, their silver-colored skins making them conspicuous targets, were poorly dispersed. 55-gallon drums of high-octane fuel, 500,000 gallons in all, were stashed around the edge of the field. Ammunition was piled in open-air revetments. The slit trenches dug to provide emergency shelter could accommodate approximately 300 people. Most of the Americans, 8th Air Force men, had become accustomed to the relative security of their English bases. Furthermore, the Americans had been promised around-the-clock fighter protection by their hosts. By 11:15 p.m., most of the ground crews, having refueled and rearmed the B-17S, were either in bed or engaged in poker games and bull sessions. The bomber crews were nearly all asleep in Poltava's large tent city. Not surprisingly, when an air raid warning came minutes later, the tired men, in the words of one, merely turned over and cussed because they had been awakened. A surprise nighttime attack. Things changed in less than an hour when about 150 bombers of German General Rudolf Meister's 4th Flying Corps arrived. Anti-aircraft guns, 85 mm and 37 mm, barked to life, followed by the chatter of smaller weapons. The sirens recently given to the Russians added their plaintive howl to the growing noise. Searchlight beams fingered the night sky. At almost precisely 12:30 that morning of June 22nd, a swastika-marked plane buzzed the field. Flares whooshed into blinding blue-white blossoms in its wake. Men were fleeing their tents in confusion, uncertain where to go when the bombs came. It was a hellish cacophony of shrill whistling, body-crushing detonations, and concussion waves accompanied by sprays of fragments. One airman reportedly complained, as he ran in his underwear, that he had never been in an air raid before. "I've always been on the other end, dropping the bombs." Ground crewmen directed newcomers to the trenches. One cockpit crew sought safety behind a pile of bricks. A bomb exploding about a dozen feet away killed the co-pilot and mortally wounded the pilot. German Air Force deals. Devastating blow in under 2 hours. Most of the Luftwaffe bombers, twin-engined Heinkel He-111S and Junkers Ju-88S, pounded Poltava between 12:35 and 1:45. After a brief lull, broken by exploding aircraft and munitions, the rest swooped in at a lower level, machine guns blazing. Their loads included thousands of small anti-personnel mines called butterflies. They fluttered down on stubby wings that opened up to arm them. At 2:20 a.m., adding insult to injury, flash bombs lit up the airfield anew for a reconnaissance plane to photograph the damage. Although the last of the aircraft engine noise faded to the west just before 2:30, Russian anti-aircraft guns continued firing for another 15 minutes. In all, gunners shot off over 28,000 rounds of ammunition. Yet all of the German aircraft returned to their base near German-occupied Minsk. Not one Allied fighter had risen to challenge them. In a period of just over 100 minutes, the Luftwaffe bombers had ravaged Poltava airfield with over 110 tons of high explosives and fragmentation and incendiary bombs. According to the Eastern Command Damage Report, 47 B-17S, 2 C-47S, and a Lockheed F-5, photo reconnaissance version of the P-38 Lightning fighter, were destroyed or damaged beyond economical repair. Every other fortress and 2 F-5S received some form of damage. Miraculously, only 2 Americans died, Lieutenants Raymond Esla, the pilot, and Joseph Lukacek. 6 enlisted men were wounded. Nearly 2,000 bombs and 400,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition were obliterated. Over 200,000 gallons of aviation fuel brought halfway around the world went up in flames. 6 vehicles were totaled. The Russians reported 34 fatalities and over 60 wounded. They lost a C-47 and 25 fighters and trainers. Poltava, one of Goering's finest moments. Aside from adding to the commotion with target practice and peppering the tents with shell fragments, the Soviets had nothing to show for their defensive effort. It was the most costly air raid the U.S. Army Air Force had suffered since the Japanese caught Douglas MacArthur's aircraft on the ground in the Philippines on December 8, 1941. After the war, an American general told Hitler's air chief that Poltava was the best attack the Luftwaffe made against U.S. aviation. Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Goering replied, "Yes, those were wonderful times." There was no questioning Russian heroism, however. Soviet soldiers, with only 1 fire truck and 2 fire trailers, hurried toward the blazing aircraft even as bombs were falling. More male and female were scouring the field to collect and detonate the deadly butterfly mines, often with sticks or by picking them up and throwing them. Other mines exploded when soldiers stepped on them. The primitive mine clearing would take weeks to complete and nearly double the Soviet casualties. To the Americans, it demonstrated a shocking disregard for human life. Ironically, the butterfly subsequently entered Moscow's military inventory as the PFM-1 anti-personnel mine. It is also called the Green Parrot because of its color, and it maimed many Afghan children after the Soviet invasion of that country in 1979. After the raid, stunned Americans emerged from whatever shelter they had found to stare at the Dantesque scene. Kept away from the field by the Russians, they gradually returned to their quarters, which German precision had spared. A short, phlegmatic pilot was quoted as telling one group of men, "It's amazing how calm a person can be in the face of death. When the raid started, I got up, dressed as calmly as I do every day." This was apparently accepted with due respect, until one listener looked at the officer's boots. They were on the wrong feet. Carbon copy raid. On Mirgorod Airfield. Later that June 22nd, beneath drifting clouds of smoke with fires still blazing and explosives occasionally going off, the Poltava base belatedly closed the proverbial barn door. The hospital tent was moved to a patch of towering sunflowers several miles away. Surviving bombers, incongruous among the twisted skeletons of the destroyed aircraft, were widely dispersed preparatory to being patched up and flown out. Ground crewmen vultured the wreckage for salvageable parts. The bombers at Mirgorod, spared that fateful night by a German navigational error, were evacuated to bases farther east. On the night of June 22nd, the Luftwaffe finally found Mirgorod. The raid was nearly a carbon copy of the Poltava attack, less than 2 hours of bombing and strafing with absolutely no interference from Russian interceptors. Nearly 200,000 gallons of gasoline and an undetermined number of bombs erupted in a miniature Vesuvius. Only Pyryatin was untouched, but only because the German raiders sent to bomb it missed their target by about 3 miles. A half-dozen C-47 transports flew in several days later to take the air crews of the destroyed and disabled aircraft to Iran en route to Britain. 72 B-17S, just over half of those that had flown in, and 57 P-51S roared off the Russian bases on June 26th and struck the oil refinery at Drohobych, Poland, before landing in Italy. There were no losses. Soviet-American relations deteriorate after raid. The Poltava disaster cast a pall over the entire Frantic operation. Morale among the base's permanent personnel never fully recovered and was to grow worse with time, contributing to increasing friction between Americans and Russians. This friction was aggravated by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, acting on Moscow's orders to discourage fraternization. On another level, U.S. commanders were concerned about Soviet inability to adequately protect American aircraft. Strategically, Frantic's raison d'etre was also being called into question. The Red Army's westward advance was overrunning targets that previously had been out of range of bases in Britain and Italy. Further, American island hopping in the Pacific was evaporating the need for bases in Russia's eastern maritime provinces. In an effort to keep Frantic alive, for continued U.S.-Soviet contact if, for no other reason, American planners decided to continue the shuttle flights, but with one major difference. Since the Americans were denied permission to establish an effective radar-controlled defense system for the bases, and because supplies there were low after the German raids, no heavy bombers were to be used. On July 22nd, Frantic III's 15th Air Force P-38S and P-51S attacked targets in Romania and flew onto Russia. From there, the 3 fighter groups involved finally brought the war to Mielec, Poland, one of the targets on Frantic Joe's wish list. Next rounds of Operation Frantic commence. The return to Italy was accomplished in 2 increments, both in response to Soviet requests for tactical sorties to support the Russian advance. Most of the fighter bombers hit airfields in Romania on July 26th. The rest attacked bases in Hungary. Frantic before consisted of 2 fighter groups of the 15th Air Force. They left Italy on July 31st and ran into bad weather, but reached Russia nevertheless. At the request of their hosts, they strafed the airfield at Focșani, Romania, on August 4th, and one in the Bucharest-Ploiești area of Romania en route back to Italy 2 days later. Each side lost half a dozen aircraft. The August 4th mission provided one of the most remarkable tales of the entire Frantic saga. A P-38 of the 82nd Fighter Group left Poltava with 1 pilot and returned with 2. As it was strafing the Focșani air base with its nose guns, one Lightning, a single-seat fighter, was hit by ground fire. Both its engines disabled, it bellied into a field. The pilot, First Lieutenant Richard E. Wilsey, was able to get out despite a head injury. A fellow pilot radioed a "cover me" to other Group P-38S and bumped to a landing alongside the downed aircraft. Lieutenant Richard T. Andrews discarded his parachute to make room and helped Wilsey into the cockpit. Riding tandem on the bucket seat with a minimum of comfort and a maximum of cooperation, the duo took off. It apparently was not the first time this feat was accomplished. An account from the earlier North African campaign tells of a South African Hawker Hurricane pilot forced down behind Axis lines and similarly saved by a fellow flyer. Soviet gunfire posed greater risk to Americans than German pilots' Frantic's operational goals, which required the use of heavy bombers, had been ignored by the last two shuttle missions. It was therefore decided to make Frantic V a B-17 mission. On August 6th, flying fortresses from two bombardment groups and P-51S from a fighter group of the 8th Air Force joined a huge formation of aircraft sent against German targets. The 76 B-17S and 64 P-51S of Frantic V broke away to lambaste an aircraft plant near Gdynia, Poland, and go on to the Russian airfields. The only aircraft combat losses were German, a Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighter, and a Ju-88. On the whole, German pilots on the Eastern Front were inferior to those in the West. In fact, many of the American airmen felt their greatest danger was Soviet gunfire. At least 7 F-5S assigned to photograph targets for the bombers were attacked by the Soviets, with one actually being shot down in June. Relieved that there was no repetition of the Poltava debacle, the fighter-escorted B-17S of Frantic V completed a local assignment against an oil refinery in Poland. The aircraft then flew to Italy, focusing their attention, at Soviet request, on Romanian airfield targets en route. They then bombed a German airbase near Toulouse, France, before returning to Britain, completing their triangular itinerary on August 12th. Pilots and ground crews also bravely fought boredom. American planners, despite realizing that Frantic was militarily unviable, were determined to see the program through. While bilateral talks, including discussion of the use of Siberian bases against Japan, dragged on in Moscow, the men and women at Poltava, Mirgorod, and Pyryatan found the late summer depressingly dull. They chased the blues as best they could through increasingly difficult personal fraternization or attending parties and shows. There were occasional side trips to Moscow and Tehran. During one trip to the Soviet capital, Frantic enlisted men experienced the psychological discomfort of sharing the Hotel Metropole dining room with the Japanese ambassador to the Soviet Union. It would be another year before the Soviet Union declared war on an almost completely prostrate Japan. Whatever their diversions, the men and women shared the common denominator of boredom. Letters from home were read until they fell apart. Paperback books split from constant reading. Decks of cards became soft and dog-eared. Bottles of vodka were filled and emptied at a prodigious rate. One happy moment came toward the end of the operation when two officers married, the woman being one of the Poltava hospital unit nurses. American bounty-fueled Soviet war effort. Their limited travel in Russia impressed the Americans with the wealth of war material being sent from the United States. Between October 1, 1941 and May 31, 1945, some 2,660 ships sailed from U.S. ports with 16,529,791 tons of supplies for Russia. A price tag on this material, which included 14,795 aircraft and 375,883 trucks, read $11.3 billion. This excluded supplies reaching the Soviet Union by other routes and contributions from Great Britain. Stalin himself admitted at the Tehran conference that the war would have been lost without American production. Yet the average Russian was never informed of this fact. With the Red Army about to knock Romania out of the war, the Americans were asked on August 22nd to immediately send a frantic mission against railroad yards there. Bad weather interfered, however, and the Russian offensive overtook the request. When Frantic 6 finally got off the ground from England on September 11th, it bombed an arms factory in Chemnitz, Germany. 2 days later, the mission's B-17S and P-51S concentrated on steelworks in Diószegyer, Hungary, and returned to Britain via Italy. By this time, Moscow saw little need to continue Operation Frantic. On August 25th, Foreign Minister Molotov had told Harriman and Dean that Russia needed its 3 shuttle fields back. The Americans asked if they could keep one base open for continued photo reconnaissance flights and to be ready for resumed shuttle flights after the approaching Russian winter. Polls rise up with promise of Red Army support. In the meantime, while fighter raids were keeping shuttle bombing alive, the Armia Krajowa, aka Home Army, 35,000 strong, in Poland's capital prepared to rise up against the Nazi occupiers. A military arm of the Polish government in exile in London, the anti-communist AK wanted to liberate Warsaw before the approaching Soviet army. Moscow actually encouraged an uprising through its radio broadcasts. "The victorious Red Armies will be in Warsaw in a matter of days," an announcer said. "People of Warsaw, take up your arms." On August 1, 1944, with the thunder of Soviet guns audible in the distance, the Poles attacked the German occupation forces. The Russian juggernaut abruptly halted at the city's eastern suburbs, although it continued to advance north and south of Warsaw. While there is still controversy over why the Soviets stopped, there can be no question that the turn of events suited their post-war purposes. The beleaguered AK radioed for help. Although the Poles had taken two-thirds of the city, they knew that they could not hold out against the more heavily armed Germans. On August 15th, a message from Washington urged Allied Supreme Commander General Dwight Eisenhower to have arms and supplies flown to Warsaw. Prohibitively long round-trip flights from Western Europe were ruled out, and heavy British losses had already demonstrated the risk of sorties from Italy. That left Frantic. Stalin's answer, in the words of U.S. diplomat George Kennan, was a snarling no. Final step in Soviet takeover of Poland. The dictator's initial step in absorbing Poland into communist orbit had occurred when the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany divided Poland in 1939. Eliminating thousands of the country's future leaders, the Soviets established a puppet Polish regime in Moscow. Stalin then obtained concessions over Poland from the U.S. and British leaders at the Tehran and Yalta conferences. The Warsaw Uprising was icing on the Russian cake. It gave the Soviets the opportunity to let the Nazis liquidate more of the potential leaders of the stubbornly nationalistic country. On September 9th, the Kremlin belatedly consented to limited mercy flights. The Red Air Force itself made some supply runs over the doomed city, dropping mismatched weapons and ammunition without parachutes from small planes. On September 18th, delayed by operational and weather problems, Frantic 7 was set into motion as over 100 fighter-escorted B-17Es left England on their 11-hour flight to Russia. In their bomb bays were 1,284 containers of weapons, food, and medical supplies. Only about 10% of these, parachuted over Warsaw, were recovered by the Poles in their shrinking defense perimeter. Stalin had ensured the outcome. 1 bomber and 2 fighters were lost to the intensive German reaction. 49 other B-17S were damaged, some heavily. Promised Soviet assistance, bombing nearby German airfields and helping escort the bombers, never materialized. The next day, 93 B-17Es and 55 P-51S left the Russian bases to strike the railroad yards at Szolnok, Hungary. The forgotten bastards of the Ukraine, Frantic 8, a second Warsaw supply mission, never got off the ground because Stalin denied the Americans the use of the Ukrainian bases. On October 5th, Polish General Tadeusz Komorowski surrendered to the Nazis. Between 215,000 and 250,000 Poles, most of them non-combatants, had died in the 2 months of fighting, while the Red Army sat on the other side of the Vistula River from the capital. Frantic, too, was gasping its last breath. It was with little regret that the main body of Americans began leaving the 3 Russian bases on the wet, chilly morning of October 5, 1944. The caretaker volunteers, 29 officers and 126 enlisted men, who remained at Poltava to keep the Frantic door ajar, received best wishes and a large supply of vodka from their departing comrades. The stay-behinds quickly dubbed themselves the forgotten bastards of the Ukraine. Those leaving were given written instructions to refrain from comments derogatory to the Soviets. Under point number 4 was the following ironic statement. "The Russians are not trying to run our country. Let's not criticize theirs. We are fighting for the right of all people to govern themselves as the majority sees fit." In any case, the Allied victories on all fronts rendered Frantic obsolete. On April 19, 1945, having finally realized that Stalin had no intention of approving a U.S. presence in Siberia, The U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff informed the Kremlin that Russian bases were no longer necessary. Nazi Germany surrendered on May 7th, and the last Americans left Poltava on June 22nd, a year after the crippling German air raid. A strategic failure and preview of the Cold War. What had Operation Frantic accomplished? Strategically, it was a failure. The Americans had good reason to regret having nagged Stalin into accepting it. Aside from being virtually superfluous at a time when Allied advances were speeding up, the operation flew too few sorties to truly affect the war effort. The hoped-for bases in the eastern maritime provinces of Russia never materialized. And despite limited success on personal levels, relations between the Soviet Union and the United States were not improved, especially after the Warsaw tragedy. Interestingly, the close contact between the top Soviet officers and the Americans may well have been the reason General Permanov and others disappeared after the war. The Germans dismissed Frantic as a demonstration to show how closely the Russians and Americans were collaborating and a mere propaganda stunt. No Luftwaffe aircraft were redeployed from the West to deal with the shuttle bombing threat. The real winner was the Soviet Union, which used the operation as a bargaining chip for concessions elsewhere. Russia also gained aircraft and equipment, including a Norden bomb site, so secret that it was long denied to even the British, a high-altitude oxygen system, and an automatic pilot. Working side by side with the Americans, hundreds of rotated Russians were trained on the sophisticated techniques and equipment of strategic bombing, a capability they previously lacked. One thing is certain, however: the disappointments of the Frantic program in no way detract from the courage and sacrifice of the personnel involved. Further, the operation, a little-known facet of World War II, was politically significant and provided a preview of the Cold War.